Chapter 3 Self-Surrender and Works, the Way of the Gita. Life, not a remote silent or high-uplifted ecstatic beyond life alone, is the field of our yoga. The transformation of our superficial, narrow, and fragmentary human way of thinking, seeing, feeling, and being into a deep and wide spiritual consciousness and an integrated inner and outer existence, and of our ordinary human living into the divine way of life, must be its central purpose. The means towards this supreme end is a self-giving of all our nature to the divine. Everything must be given to the divine within us, to the universal all, and to the transcendent supreme. An absolute concentration of our will, our heart, and our thought on that one and manifold divine, an unreserved self-consecration of our whole being to the divine alone. This is the decisive movement. The turning of the ego to that which is infinitely greater than itself, its self-giving and indispensable surrender. The life of the human creature, as it is ordinarily lived, is composed of a half-fixed, half-fluid mass of very imperfectly ruled thoughts, perceptions, sensations, emotions, desires, enjoyments, acts, mostly customary and self-repeating, in part only dynamic and self-developing, but all centered around a superficial ego. The sum of movement of these activities eventuates in an internal growth which is partly visible and operative in this life, partly a seed of progress in lives hereafter. This growth of the conscious being, an expansion and increasing self-expression, a more and more harmonized development of his constituent members, is the whole meaning and all the pith of human existence. It is for this meaningful development of consciousness by thought, will, emotion, desire, action, and experience, leading in the end to a supreme divine self-discovery, that man, the mental being, has entered into the material body. All the rest is either auxiliary and subordinate or accidental and otois. That only matters which sustains and helps the evolution of his nature and the growth, or rather the progressive unfolding and discovery of his self and spirit. The aim set before our yoga is nothing less to hasten this supreme object of our existence here. Its process leaves behind the ordinary tardy method of slow and confused growth through the evolution of nature. For the natural evolution is at best an uncertain growth under cover, partly by the pressure of the environment, partly by a groping education and an ill-lighted, purposeful effort, and only partially illumined and half-automatic use of opportunities with many blunders and lapses and relapses. A great portion of it is made up of apparent accidents and circumstances and vicissitudes, though veiling a secret divine intervention and guidance. In yoga, we replace this confused, crooked crab motion by a rapid, conscious, and self-directed evolution, which is planned to carry us as far as can be in a straight line towards the goal set before us. In a certain sense, it may be an error to speak of a goal anywhere in a progression which may well be infinite. Still, we can conceive of an immediate goal, an ulterior objective beyond our present achievement, towards which the soul and man can aspire. There lies before him the possibility of a new birth. There can be an ascent into a higher and wider plane of being, and its descent to transform his members. An enlarged and illumined consciousness is possible that shall make of him a liberated spirit and a perfected force, and, if spread beyond the individual, it might even constitute a divine humanity, or else a supramental, and therefore a superhuman race. It is this new birth that we make our aim. A growth into a divine consciousness is the whole meaning of our yoga, an integral conversion to divinity not only of the soul, but of all the parts of our nature. Our purpose in yoga is to exile the limited outward-looking ego and to enthrone God in its place as the ruling inhabitant of the nature. And this means first, to disinherit desire and no longer accept the enjoyment of desire as the ruling human motive. The spiritual life will draw its sustenance not from desire but from a pure and selfless spiritual delight of essential existence. And not only the vital nature in us whose stamp is desire, but the mental being too must undergo a new birth and a transfiguring change. Our divided, egoistic, limited and ignorant thought and intelligence must disappear. In its place there must stream in the Catholic and faultless play of the shadowless divine illumination, which shall culminate in the end in a natural self-existent truth consciousness, free from groping half-truth and stumbling error. Our confused and embarrassed ego-centered small-motived will and action must cease and make room for the total working of a swiftly powerful, lucidly automatic, divinely moved and guided unfallen force. There must be implanted and activized in all our doings a supreme, impersonal, unfaltering and unstumbling will in spontaneous and untroubled unison with the will of the divine. The unsatisfying surface play of our feeble, egoistic emotions must be ousted, and there must be revealed instead, a secret, deep, and vast psychic heart within that waits behind them for its hour. All our feelings, impelled by this inner heart in which dwells the divine, will be transmuted into calm and intense movements of a twin passion of divine love and manifold Ananda. This is the definition of a divine humanity or a supermental race. This is not an exaggerated or even a sublimated energy of human intellect and action. Is the type of the Superman whom we are called to evolve by our yoga. In the ordinary human existence, an outgoing action is obviously 3/4 or even more of our life. It is only the exceptions, the saint and the seer, the rare thinker, poet and artist, who can live more within themselves. These indeed, at least in the innermost intimate parts of their nature, shape themselves more in inner thought and feeling than in surface act. But it is not either of these sides separated from the other, but rather a harmony of the inner and outer life made one in fullness and transfigured into a play of something that is beyond them, which will create the form of a perfect living. A yoga of works, a union of the divine in our will and acts, and not only in knowledge and feeling, is then an indispensable and inexpressibly important element of the integral yoga. The conversion of our thought and feeling without a corresponding conversion of the spirit and body of our works would be a maimed achievement. But if this total conversion is to be done, there must be a consecration of our actions and outer movements as much as our mind and heart to the divine. There must be accepted and progressively accomplished a surrender of our capacities of working into the hands of a greater power behind us, and our sense of being the doer and worker must disappear. All must be given for a more direct use into the hands of the divine will, which is hidden by these frontal appearances. For by that permitting will alone is our action possible. A hidden power is the true Lord and overruling observer of our acts, and only He knows, through all the ignorance and perversion and deformation brought in by the ego, their complete sense and ultimate purpose. There must be effected a complete transformation of our limited and distorted egoistic life and works into the large and direct outpouring of a greater divine life, will, and energy that now secretly supports us. This greater will and energy must be made conscious in us and master. No longer must it remain, as now, only a superconscious and upholding permitting force. There must be achieved an undistorted transmission through us of the all-wise purpose and process of a now hidden omniscient power and omnipotent knowledge, which will turn into its pure, unobstructed, happily consenting and participating channel all our transmuted nature. This total consecration and surrender, and this resultant entire transformation and free transmission make up the whole fundamental means and the ultimate aim of an integral karma yoga. Even for those whose first natural movement is a consecration, a surrender, and a resultant entire transformation of the thinking mind and its knowledge, or a total consecration, surrender, and transformation of the heart and its emotions, the consecration of works is a needed element in that change. Otherwise, although they may find God in other life, they will not be able to fulfill the divine in life. Life for them will be a meaningless undivine in consequence. Not for them the true victory that shall be the key to the riddle of our terrestrial existence. Their love will not be the absolute love triumphant over self. Their knowledge will not be the total consciousness and the all-embracing knowledge. It is possible indeed to begin with knowledge or Godward emotion solely, or with both together, and to leave works for the final movement of the yoga. But there is then this disadvantage that we may tend to live too exclusively within, subtilized in subjective experience, shut off in our isolated inner parts. There we may get encrusted in our spiritual seclusion and find it difficult later on to pour ourselves triumphantly outwards and apply to life our gains in the higher nature. When we turn to add this external kingdom also to our inner conquests, we shall find ourselves too much accustomed to an activity purely subjective and ineffective on the material plane. There will be an immense difficulty in transforming the outer life and the body, or we shall find that our action does not correspond with the inner light. It still follows the old accustomed mistaken paths, still obeys the old normal imperfect influences. The truth within us continues to be separated by a painful gulf from the ignorant mechanism of our external nature. This is a frequent experience because, in such a process, the light and power come to be self-contained and unwilling to express themselves in life or to use the physical means prescribed for the earth and her processes. It is as if we were living in another, a larger and subtler world, and had no divine hold, perhaps little hold of any kind, upon the material and terrestrial nature. Terrestrial existence. But still, each must follow his nature, and there are always difficulties that have to be accepted for some time if we are to pursue our natural path of yoga. Yoga is, after all, primarily a change of the inner consciousness and nature, and if the balance of our parts is such that this must be done first with an initial exclusiveness, and the rest left for later handling, we must accept the apparent imperfection of the process. Yet, would the ideal working of an integral yoga be a movement, even from the beginning, integral in its process, and whole and many-sided its progress? In any case, our present preoccupation is with a yoga integral in its aim and complete movement, but starting from works and proceeding by works, although at each step more and more moved by vivifying divine love and more illumined by a helping divine knowledge. The greatest gospel of spiritual works ever yet given to the race, the most perfect system of karma yoga known to man in the past, is to be found in the Bhagavad Gita. In that famous episode of the Mahabharata, the great basic lines of karma yoga are laid down for all time with an incomparable mastery and the infallible eye of an assured experience. It is true that that path alone, as the ancients saw it, is worked out fully. The perfect fulfillment, the highest secret, is hinted rather than developed. It is kept back as an unexpressed part of a supreme mystery. There are obvious reasons for this reticence, for the fulfillment is in any case a matter for experience, and no teaching can express it. It cannot be described in any way that can really be understood by a mind that has not the effulgent transmuting experience. And for the soul that has passed the shining portals and stands in the blaze of the inner light, all mental and verbal description is as poor as it is superfluous, inadequate, and impertinence. All divine consummations have perforce to be figured by us in the inapt and deceptive terms of a language that has been made fit which was made to fit the normal experience of mental man, so expressed they can be rightly understood only by those who already know, and knowing are able to give these poor external terms a changed, inner, and transfigured sense. As the Vedic rishis insisted in the beginning, the words of the supreme wisdom are expressive only to those who are already of the wise. The Gita, at its cryptic close, may seem, by its silence, to stop short of that solution for which we are seeking. It pauses at the borders of the highest spiritual mind and does not cross them into the splendors of the supramental light. And yet, its secret of dynamic and not only static identity with the inner presence, its highest mystery of absolute surrender to the divine guide, Lord, and inhabitant of our nature, is the central secret. This surrender is the indispensable means of the supramental change, and again, it is through the supramental change that the dynamic identity becomes possible. What then are the lines of karma yoga laid down by the Gita? Its key principle, its spiritual method, can be summed up as the union of two largest and highest states or powers of consciousness, equality and oneness. The kernel of its method is an unreserved acceptance of the divine in our life as in our inner self and spirit. An inner renunciation of personal desire leads to equality, accomplishes our total surrender to the divine, supports a delivery from dividing ego, which brings us oneness. But this must be a oneness in dynamic force and not only in static peace or inactive beatitude. The Gita promises us freedom for the spirit even in the midst of works and the full energies of nature. If we accept subjection of our whole being to that which is higher than the separating and limiting ego, it proposes an integral dynamic activity founded on a still passivity, a largest possible action irrevocably based on an immobile calm, and is its secret, free expression out of a supreme inward silence. All things here are the one and indivisible, eternal, transcendent, and cosmic Brahman. That is in its secret, that is in its seeming, divided in things and creatures, in seeming only, for in truth it is always one and equal in all things and creatures, and the division is only a phenomenon of the surface. As long as we live in the ignorant seeming, we are the ego and are subject to the modes of nature, enslaved to appearances, bound to the dualities, tossed between good and evil, sin and virtue, grief and joy, pain and pleasure, good fortune and ill fortune, success and failure. We follow helplessly the iron or gilt and iron round of the wheel of Maya. At best, we have only the poor relative freedom which by us is ignorantly called free will. But that is at the bottom illusory, since it is the modes of nature that express themselves through our personal will. It is force of nature, grasping us, ungrasped by us, that determines what we shall will and how we shall will it. Nature, not an independent ego, chooses what object we shall seek, whether by reasoned will or unreflecting impulse, at any moment of our existence. If, on the contrary, we live in the unifying reality of the Brahman, then we go beyond the ego and overstep nature, for then we get back to our true self and become the spirit. In the spirit, we are above the impulsion of nature, superior to her modes and forces. Attaining to a perfect equality in the soul, mind, and heart, we realize that our true self of oneness, one with all beings, one too with that which expresses itself in them, and in all that we see and experience. This equality and this oneness are the indispensable twin foundation we must lay down for a divine being, a divine consciousness, a divine action. Not one with all, we are not spiritual, not divine. Not equal soul to all things, happenings, and creatures, we cannot see spiritually, cannot know divinely, cannot feel divinely towards others. The supreme power, The one eternal and infinite is equal to all things and to all beings, and because it is equal, it can act with an absolute wisdom according to the truth of its works and its force, and according to the truth of each thing and of every creature. This is also the only true freedom possible to man, a freedom which he cannot have unless he outgrows his mental separativeness and becomes the conscious soul in nature. The only free will in the world is the one divine will, of which nature is the executrix, for she is the master and creator of all other wills. Human free will can be real in a sense, but like all things that belong to the modes of nature, it is only relatively real. The mind rides on a swirl of natural forces, balances on a poise between several possibilities, inclines to one side or another, settles, and has the sense of choosing. But it does not see. It is not even dimly aware of the force behind that has determined its choice. It cannot see, because that force is something total and to our eyes indeterminate. At most, mind can only distinguish with an approach to clarity and precision some out of the complex variety of particular determinations by which this force works out her incalculable purposes. Partial itself, the mind rides on a part of the machine, unaware of 9/10 of its motor agencies in time and environment, unaware of its past preparation and future drift. But because it rides, it thinks that it is directing the machine. In a sense, it counts, for that clear inclination of the mind which we call our will, that firm settling of the inclination which presents itself to us as a deliberate choice, is one of nature's most powerful determinants, but it is never independent in soul. Behind this petty instrumental action of the human will, there is something vast and powerful and eternal that oversees the tread of the inclination and presses on the turn of the will. There is a total truth in nature greater than our individual choice. And in this total truth, or even beyond and behind it, there is something that determines all results. Its presence and secret knowledge keeps up steadily in the process of nature a dynamic, almost automatic perception of the right relations, the varying or persistent necessities, the inevitable steps of the movement. There is a secret divine will, eternal and infinite, omniscient and omnipotent, that expresses itself in the universality and in each particular of all these apparently temporal and finite, inconscient or half-conscient things. This is the power or presence meant by the Gita when it speaks of the Lord within the heart of all existences, who turns all creatures as if mounted on a machine by the illusion of nature. This divine will is not an alien power or presence. It is intimate to us, and we ourselves are part of it, for it is only our highest self that possesses and supports it. Only, it is not our conscious mental will. It rejects often enough what our consciousness will accepts, and accepts what our conscious will rejects. For while this secret one knows all and every whole, and rejects... For while this secret one knows all, and every whole and each detail, our surface mind knows only a little part of things. Our will is conscious in the mind, and what it knows by the thought only. The divine will is superconscious to us, because it is in its essence supramental, and it knows all because it is all. Our highest self, which possesses and supports this universal power, is not our ego self, not our personal nature. It is something transcendent and universal, of which these smaller things are only foam and flowing surface. If we surrender our conscious will and allow it to be made one with the will of the eternal, then and only then shall we attain to a true freedom. Living in the divine liberty, we shall no longer cling to this shackled so-called free will, a puppet-free, ignorant, illusory, relative, bound to the error of its own inadequate vital motives and mental figures. A distinction has to be firmly seized in our consciousness, the capital distinction between the mechanical nature and the free lord of nature, between the Ishvara, or single luminous divine will, and the many executive modes and forces of the universe. Nature, not as she is in her divine truth, the conscious power of the eternal, but as she appears to us in the ignorance, is executive force, mechanical in her steps, not consciously intelligent to our experience of her, although all her works are instinct with an absolute intelligence. Not in herself master, she is full of a self-aware power, which has an infinite mastery, and because of this power driving her, she rules all and exactly fulfills the work intended in her by the Ishwara. Not enjoying, but enjoyed, she bears in herself the burden of all enjoyments. Nature as Prakriti is an inertly active force, for she works out a movement imposed upon her, but within her is one that knows. Some entity sits there that is aware of all her motion and process. Prakriti works containing the knowledge, the mastery, the delight of the Purusha, the being associated with her or seen within her, but she can participate in them only by subjection and reflection of that which fulfills her. Purusha knows and is still and inactive. He contains the action of Prakriti within his consciousness and knowledge and enjoys it. He gives the sanction to Prakriti's works, and she works out what is sanctioned by him for his pleasure. Purusha himself does not execute. He maintains Prakriti in her action and allows her to express in energy and process and formed result what he perceives in his knowledge. This is the distinction made by the Sankhayas, and although it is not all the true truth, not in any way the highest truth either of Purusha or of Prakriti, still it is a valid and indispensable practical knowledge in the lower hemisphere of existence. The individual soul, or the conscious being in a form, may identify itself with this experiencing Purusha or with its active Prakriti. If it identifies itself with Prakriti, it is not master, enjoyer, and knower, but reflects the modes and workings of Prakriti. It enters by its identification into that subjection and mechanical working which is characteristic of her, and even by an entire immersion in Prakriti, the soul becomes inconscient or subconscient, asleep in her forms as in the earth and the metal, or almost asleep as in plant life. There, in that inconscience, it is subject to the dominion of tamas, the principle, the power of the qualitative mode of obscurity and inertia. Sattva and rajas are there, but they are concealed in the thick coating of tamas. Emerging into its own proper nature of consciousness, but not yet truly conscious, because there is still too great a domination of the tamas in the nature, the embodied being becomes more and more subject to rajas, the principle, the power, the qualitative mode of action and passion, impelled by desire and instinct. There is then formed and developed the animal nature, narrow in consciousness, rudimentary in intelligence, rajaso-tamasic in vital habit and impulse. Emerging yet farther from the great inconscience towards a spiritual status, the embodied being liberates sattva, the mode of light, and acquires a relative freedom and mastery, and knowledge, and with it a qualified and conditioned sense of inner satisfaction and happiness. Man, the mental being in a physical body, should be but is not, except in a few among this multitude of ensouled bodies of this nature. Ordinarily, he has too much in him of the obscure earth inertia and a troubled, ignorant animal life force to be the soul of light and bliss, or even a mind of harmonious will and knowledge. There is here in man an incomplete and still hampered and baffled ascension towards the true character of the Purusha, free, master, knower, and enjoyer. For these are in human and earthly experience relative modes, none giving its single and absolute fruit. All are intermixed with each other, and there is not the pure action of one of them anywhere. It is their confused and inconstant interaction that determines the experiences of the egoistic human consciousness swinging in nature's uncertain balance. The sign of the immersion of the embodied soul in Prakriti is the limitation of consciousness to the ego. The vivid stamp of this limited consciousness can be seen in a constant inequality of the mind and heart and a confused conflict and disharmony in their varied reactions to the touches of experience. The human reactions sway perpetually between the dualities created by the soul's subjection to nature, and by its often intense but narrow struggle for mastery and enjoyment, a struggle for the most part ineffective. The soul circles in an unending round of nature's alluring and distressing opposites, success and failure, good fortune and ill fortune, good and evil, sin and virtue, joy and grief, pain and pleasure. It is only when, awakening from its immersion in Prakriti, it perceives its oneness with the One, and its oneness with all existences, that it can become free from these things, and found its right relation to this executive world nature. Then it becomes indifferent to her inferior modes, equal-minded to her dualities, capable of mastery and freedom. It is seated above her as the high-throned knower and witness filled with the calm, intense, unalloyed delight of his own eternal existence. The embodied spirit continues to express its powers in action, but it is no longer involved in ignorance, no longer bound by its works. Its actions have no consequence within it, but only a consequence outside in Prakriti. This whole movement of nature becomes to its experience a rising and falling of waves on the surface that make no difference to its own unfathomable peace, its wide delight, its vast universal equality, or its boundless God existence. These are the conditions of our effort, and they point to an ideal which can be expressed in these or equivalent formulae. To live in God, and not in the ego. To move vastly founded, not in the little egoistic consciousness, but in the consciousness of the all-soul and transcendent. To be perfectly equal in all happenings and to all beings, and to see and feel them as one with oneself, and one with the divine, to feel all in oneself and all in God, to feel God in all, oneself in all. To act in God and not in the ego. And here, first, not to choose action by reference to personal needs and standards, but in obedience to the dictates of the living highest truth above us. Next, as soon as we are sufficiently founded in the spiritual consciousness, not to act any longer by our separate will or movement, but more and more to allow action to happen and develop under the impulsion and guidance of a divine will that surpasses us. And last, the supreme result, to be exalted into an identity in knowledge, force, consciousness, act, joy of existence with the divine Shakti. To feel a dynamic movement not dominated by mortal desire and vital instinct and impulse and elusive mental free will, but luminously conceived and evolved in an immortal self-delight and infinite self-knowledge. For this is the action that comes by a conscious subjection and merging of the natural man into the divine self and eternal spirit. It is the spirit that forever transcends and guides this world nature. But what practical steps of self-discipline can we by what practical steps of self-discipline can we arrive at this consummation? The elimination of all egoistic activity and its foundation, the egoistic consciousness, is clearly the key to the consummation we desire. And since in the path of works, action is the knot we have first to loosen, we must endeavor to loosen it where it is centrally tied, in desire and in ego. For otherwise we shall cut only stray strands, and not the heart of our bondage. These are the two knots of our subjection to this ignorant and divided nature, desire and ego sense. And of these two, desire has its native home in the emotions and sensations and instincts, and from there it affects thought and volition. Ego sense lives indeed in these movements, but it casts its deep roots also in the thinking mind and its will, and it is there that it becomes fully self-conscious. These are the twin obscure powers of the obsessing worldwide ignorance that we have to enlighten and eliminate. In the field of action, desire takes many forms. But the most powerful of all is the vital self-craving or seeking after the fruit of our works. The fruit we covet may be a reward of internal pleasure. It may be the accomplishment of some preferred idea, or some cherished will, or the satisfaction of the egoistic emotions, or else the pride of success of our highest hopes and ambitions, or it may be an external reward, a recompense entirely material, wealth, position, honor, victory, good fortune, or any other fulfillment of vital or physical desire, but all alike are lures by which egoism holds us. Always these satisfactions delude us with the sense of mastery and the idea of freedom, while really we are harnessed and guided or ridden and whipped by some gross or subtle, some noble or ignoble figure of the blind desire that drives the world. Therefore, the first rule of action laid down by the Gita is to do work that should be done without any desire for the fruit. Niskama karma. A simple rule in appearance, and yet how difficult to carry out with anything like an absolute sincerity and liberating entireness. In the greater part of our action, we use the principle very little, if at all, and then even mostly as a sort of counterpoise to the normal principle of desire and to mitigate the extreme action of that tyrant impulse. At best, we are satisfied if we arrive at a modified and disciplined egoism, not too shocking to our moral sense, not too brutally offensive to others. And to our partial self-discipline we give various names and forms. We habituate ourselves by practice to the sense of duty, to a firm fidelity to principle, a stoic fortitude or religious resignation, a quiet or an ecstatic submission to God's will. But it is not these things that the Gita intends. Useful though they are in their place, it aims at something absolute, unmitigated, uncompromising, a turn, an attitude that will change the whole poise of the soul. Not the mind's control of vital impulse is its rule, but the strong immobility of an immortal spirit. The test it lays down is an absolute equality of mind and the heart to all results, to all reactions, and to all happenings. If good fortune and ill fortune, if respect and insult, if reputation and obloquy, if victory and defeat, if pleasant event and sorrowful event leave us not only unshaken but untouched, free in the emotions, free in the nervous reactions, free in the mental view, not responding with the least disturbance or vibration in any spot of the nature, then we have the absolute liberation to which the Gita points to us, but not otherwise. The tiniest reaction is a proof that the discipline is imperfect and that some part of us accepts ignorance and bondage as its law and clings still to the old nature. Our self-consequence is only partially accomplished. It is still imperfect or unreal in some stretch or part or smallest spot of the ground of our nature, and that little pebble of imperfection may throw down the whole achievement of the yoga. There are certain semblances of an equal spirit which must not be mistaken for the profound and vast spiritual equality which the Gita teaches. There is an equality of disappointed resignation, an equality of pride, an equality of hardness and indifference. All these are egoistic in their nature. Inevitably, they come in the course of the sadhana, but they must be rejected or transformed into a true quietude. There is too, on a higher level, the equality of the stoic, the equality of the devout resignation, or a sage detachment, the equality of a soul aloof from the world and indifferent to its doings. These two are insufficient, first approaches they can be, but they are at most early soul phases only, or imperfect mental preparations for our entry into the true and absolute self-existent wideness of the spirit. For it is certain that so great a result cannot be arrived at immediately, or without any previous stages. At first we have to learn to bear the shocks of the world with the central part of our being untouched and silent, even when the surface mind, heart, life are strongly shaken. Unmoved there, on the bedrock of our life, we must separate the soul watching behind or immune, deep within, from these outer workings of our nature. Afterwards, extending this calm and steadfastness of the detached soul to its instruments, it will become slowly possible to radiate peace from the luminous center to the dark peripheries. In this process, we may take the passing help of many minor phases, a certain stoicism, a certain calm philosophy, a certain religious exaltation may help us towards some nearness to our aim, or we may call in even less strong and exalted but still useful powers of our mental nature. In the end, we must either discard or transform them and arrive instead at an entire equality, a perfect self-existent peace within, and even if we can, a total, unassailable, self-poised, spontaneous delight in all our members. But how then shall we continue to act at all? For ordinarily, the human being acts because he has a desire or feels a mental, vital, or physical want or need. He is driven by the necessities of the body, by the lust for riches, honors or fame, or by a craving for the personal satisfactions of the mind or the heart, or a craving for power or pleasure, or he is seized or pushed about by a moral need, or, at least, the need or the desire of making his ideas or his ideals or his will or his party or his country or his gods prevail in the world. If none of these desires nor any other must be the spring of our action, it would seem as if all incentive or motive power had been removed and action itself must necessarily cease. The Gita replies with its third great secret of the divine life. All action must be done in a more and more Godward and finally God-possessed consciousness. Our works must be a sacrifice to the divine, and in the end, a surrender of all our being, mind, will, heart, sense, life, and body to the one must make God-love and God service our only motive. This transformation of the motive force and very character of works is indeed its master idea. It is the foundation of this unique synthesis of works, love, and knowledge. In the end, not desire, but the consciously felt will of the eternal remains as the sole driver of our action and the sole originator of its initiative. Equality, renunciation of all desire for the fruit of our works, action done as a sacrifice of the Supreme Lord of our nature and of all nature. These are the three first Godward approaches in the Gita's way of karma yoga.